For a century, the Titanic has been hidden in darkness. But now, a new investigation is about to drain the ocean. We uncover critical new pieces of evidence not previously visible.
For over 40 years, millions of eyes have been fixed on the Titanic's bow, where the railings still stand upright and the massive anchors rest undisturbed. But there is a far more disturbing truth that the camera almost never shows. A few hundred meters beyond that famous front half, the other half of the ship is not resting in quiet dignity. It has been torn apart, crushed, and twisted beyond recognition. So, why do we so rarely see the stern? The answer lies in a violent mechanism of collapse that stayed hidden for more than a century. The back half that was never revealed. The Titanic stretched nearly 900 feet in length. What the world has been staring at for 4 decades is a fragment of that size. The fragment that the eye can follow and the mind can hold on to. The other half, a few hundred meters beyond the bow, is a different matter entirely. It has been torn apart, crushed, and twisted beyond recognition. It barely looks like a ship at all. This is not a minor omission. The stern, the back half of the Titanic, is one of the 2 main sections of a wreck that sits at the center of one of the most documented disasters in modern history. And yet, if you go looking for footage of it, you will find almost nothing. The visual record of the Titanic wreck is so unevenly documented that the imbalance itself becomes the first clue that something about the stern makes people uncomfortable. Part of what cemented the bow's place in public imagination was timing. When Dr. Robert Ballard and his team discovered the wreck on September 1st, 1985, the first clear sign they found was not the ship itself, but one of the Titanic's boilers sitting alone on the seafloor. From there, the trail of wreckage led them to the bow. What the cameras showed when they got there was striking, not because the bow was pristine, but because it was recognizable. The human mind grabs onto what it can recognize, and the bow gave people something clear to hold on to. Despite spending over 7 decades in near freezing darkness, the front of the ship still had enough order left in it to feel familiar. Then the footage that locked that picture in place soon surfaced. In 1986, Ballard's team returned with the submersible Alvin and the small remote vehicle Jason Jr. Those dives marked the first time human eyes had seen the wreck since the ship went down in 1912. The close-up images that came back spread everywhere. They were in documentaries, books, museum displays, and eventually, wider culture. Even people who knew almost nothing else about the wreck knew that shape, and that familiarity slowly became a problem. Because the bow was so famous, so easy to recognize, and so often shown, people started to feel like they had already seen the wreck. But the Titanic didn't rest below in one sad, grand piece. The bow had made viewers believe that although the catastrophe claimed over 1,500 lives, the ship itself rests below as an eternal memorial lying peacefully on the ocean floor. This assumption embedded itself so deeply in popular culture that it created what can only be called a cognitive blind spot. Filmmakers usually focused on the bow because it was the most recognizable part of the ship. A documentary camera can give you beautiful pictures without telling you exactly where those pictures were taken. That is a significant problem if you want to understand the whole site. So the illusion held. The bow became the face of the Titanic on the ocean floor, and the stern, a few hundred meters away, sitting in the same darkness, remained almost entirely unseen. But why was there a hesitation to reveal the stern? The fight over how the Titanic sank. Before anyone had ever seen the wreck, there was already a fight about what happened to it. That fight lasted 73 years, and the wrong side won. On the night the Titanic sank, the 706 people who survived did not all come away with the same story. In the cold, the dark, the noise, and the panic, people saw different pieces of the same disaster. Some said the ship slipped beneath the surface as one piece. Others described the ship's back end lifting high out of the water, the hull giving way somewhere in the middle, and the whole structure breaking apart before it disappeared. They spoke of a terrible tearing sound, a roar of metal, and the stern rising almost vertical before its final plunge. Among those who said the ship broke was Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old first-class passenger, who later described the ship splitting apart, with the forward section going under first. But these accounts ran into a wall almost immediately. Charles Lytler, the highest-ranking officer to survive the sinking, said the ship went down intact. That answer carried enormous weight. In the aftermath of a disaster like this, rank matters. People tend to trust officers over frightened passengers, especially when the officers speak with certainty. The American inquiry opened on April 19, 1912, just 4 days after the sinking, and ran until May 25th. More than 80 people were interviewed. The British inquiry followed in May. Senior crew members were heard, passengers were heard, experts were heard. But the version backed by authority had a clear advantage from the start. And so, even though the accounts clashed, the official record sided with the officers and technical experts who argued that the Titanic's steel structure was too strong to fracture. There was also a cultural reason this version survived. The Titanic was supposed to be massive, strong, almost beyond belief. The idea that it could split apart in open water sounded too chaotic, too unglamorous, too much at odds with the image of a great liner meeting its end with dignity. So, for decades, the breakup was doubted, pushed aside, or treated as uncertain, even though some survivors had stated it plainly from the beginning. The one-piece sinking was easier to print in books and repeat in documentaries. But then, on September 1st, 1985, when Ballard's team found the wreck, the old argument could not survive the seafloor. The ship was lying in two main sections, separated by roughly 2,000 feet of open ocean. That single fact changed the story of the Titanic overnight. Even then, the full truth did not land all at once. Finding the two sections proved the ship had broken apart. It did not answer the harder question of how. That answer came decades later. In 2022, a massive scan of the wreck site gathered hundreds of thousands of images and helped researchers build a complete digital model. When they studied the broken hull pieces scattered across the site, they reached a harder conclusion than the simple version most people had grown up with. The Titanic did not part in one neat, clean snap. It was violently torn apart. It means the final moments were messier, rougher, and more savage than the softened version that had been passed down for decades. And it means that everything the stern endured began not at the bottom of the ocean, but on the surface, in the last minutes before it went under. The horror of the debris field. The space between the two halves of the Titanic is not empty water and clean sand. It is a long field of wreckage spread across the ocean floor, in darkness so complete that sunlight has never once reached it. To travel from the bow to the stern is to cross a graveyard, and the closer you get to the stern, the more the site stops looking like a sunken ship and starts looking like a frozen crash scene. When remotely operated vehicles begin the crossing, the first objects that appear are the lightest, things that were carried by currents as they fell. Thousands of tons of coal spilled from the fuel bunkers as the ship broke apart. Shards of fine china, pieces of luggage forced open, their contents long since dissolved. The remnants were scattered across the seabed, in no particular order. These objects remain identifiable because of the chemistry of deep-sea preservation. Leather, rubber, and dense fabrics survive at 12,500 feet, in ways that organic material cannot. The human remains they once clothed are gone, but the shoes remain, side by side, exactly as they settled more than a century ago. As the crossing continues and the wreckage grows denser, the feeling changes. Hull plates begin to appear, but they no longer carry the graceful curves visible at the bow. They are twisted, torn, contorted like crumpled paper. Massive steam pipes lie scattered, ripped from reinforced joints. Enormous metal structures sit in disarray, their original function almost impossible to identify. Ocean explorers describe guiding a remotely operated vehicle through this region as an exercise in tension. Sonar maps grow difficult to interpret because of the uneven terrain formed by pile metal, and seafloor currents grow more unpredictable, swirling around large masses and threatening expensive equipment. For many years, the trips to the Titanic were focused on capturing dramatic footage, not on building a full picture of the site. That created a distorted record of striking images, but no real sense of layout. It was now discovered that older assumptions about the debris field being arranged in one simple comet-like trail did not fully match what more careful surveys eventually showed. There were multiple debris fields and pieces that did not fit the clean old picture. The The site was more complex than the public had been shown. But in 2022, when two remote robots spent 3 weeks moving across the wreck site, capturing around 715,000 images and millions of laser measurements, that all changed. The result was a complete model of the site that finally let researchers step back and see it as one connected place, rather than a pile of separate dive memories. For the first time, people could see the true scale of the wreckage field clearly, not just one famous section at a time. And the model confirmed that the debris field is a broad, complex spread that reflects the stages of the ship's destruction. The breakup at the surface, the different rates of descent, the tumbling fall through 2 miles of open ocean. What looks from a distance like a scattering of random wreckage is actually a physical record of how the Titanic came apart, piece by piece, between the surface and the floor. And that record grows harder to look at the further you follow it south. What the stern actually looks like. When you look at the bow of the Titanic, you can find the bridge and you can find the deck. Even after more than a century on the seafloor, there is enough order left in it that the eye knows what it is looking at. The stern does the opposite. It hits you like a wrecked machine. The decks that once hosted third-class promenades and smoking rooms have collapsed completely, compressed into one another in a crushing vertical stack. Spaces that were once several feet high are now narrow cavities, flattened under immense weight. The hull, thick steel designed to withstand the fiercest ocean storms, has been peeled away from its frame. In many places, the plates are bent outward, exposing the mechanical interior of a ship that was never meant to be seen this way. There are no elegant lines here. There are no familiar shapes. What sits at the far end of the debris field is a huge mass of mangled steel, and it barely reads as a vessel at all. Before the later model was created, in 2010, researchers built detailed photo mosaics of the wreck, including full overhead and side views of the stern. Those images showed that the stern was not just damaged in parts, it was deeply broken across its entire form. Scientists at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution described it as a heavily damaged stern section. National Geographic called it the Titanic's mangled stern resting on the seabed. The overhead view shows major structural damage across the entire area. Parts of the stern sag into one another. Openings appear where there should have been enclosed spaces. Walls, decks, and framing became layers of wreckage pressed together. And yet, in the middle of all that damage, some enormous features break through. The 2 massive steam engines, each roughly 4 stories tall, still stand inside the torn section, protected by the density and robustness of their construction. Another view from the same imaging work showed 5 boilers still in place in Boiler Room 2. At the aft end, the keel is driven deep into the thick, clay-like seabed. The port propeller can still be seen there, partially buried. The rudder cuts down into the sediment, with 2 propeller blades visible in the murk nearby. One longtime Titanic researcher described being near the stern as hunting for anything recognizable, any pattern at all in the chaos. The bow offers clear markers. The stern fights back. It asks the viewer to sort through bent steel, torn openings, exposed machinery, and broken forms that no longer look like the rooms and decks they once were. That is also why the stern never settled into public memory the way the bow did. It is not that the stern is small. This is still one of the 2 great main sections of the wreck, and it is massive. But its surfaces do not guide the viewer. Instead, they confuse. There is no single recognizable feature to anchor the eye, no architectural landmark to give the image a shape that an audience can hold on to. So, it gets left out of documentaries. It gets skipped in museum displays. 3-dimensional models meticulously reconstruct the bow while leaving the stern as a vague outline, because it resembles the aftermath of an explosion more than a shipwreck. And the question it raises is a hard one. How can 2 halves of the same vessel, sinking to the same depth, meet such radically different fates? The impact of 2 different falls? To understand why the Titanic's back half ended up in the state it did, we have to go back to the last 20 minutes of April 15, 1912, before the Titanic met its end. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, water flooded the forward compartments over the course of more than 2 hours. By the time the bow slipped beneath the surface, most of its internal spaces were already filled with water. The pressure inside the hull and the pressure outside it had largely equalized. When the bow separated and began its descent, it moved through the water the way a submarine moves when it opens its ballast tanks. In a controlled, streamlined fall, cutting cleanly through 2 miles of ocean before making comparatively controlled contact with the seabed. The stern was a completely different story. When the ship broke apart at the surface, the aft section was still filled with air. It contained vast cargo holds, refrigerated storage spaces, hundreds of third-class cabins. These were enormous air pockets, and they were still intact when the stern began to sink. Unlike the bow, which had a pointed end to lead the fall, the stern had been ripped open where it separated. It had no clean shape to cut through the water with. Instead of dropping like a heavy dart, it fell more like a huge broken shell, open at one end, full of air, with nothing to hold it steady. That alone meant the back half was always going to have a rougher trip down than the front half ever did. Researchers have long described the stern's descent as tumbling and corkscrewing for more than 2 miles. It was not just sinking, it was rolling, turning, and twisting as it went. When Park Stevenson studied the 2022 full-sight scan, he said the clearest explanation for the stern's condition is that it spiraled down as it fell, tearing itself apart as it went. Once the stern separated from the rest of the ship, the water would have grabbed it from every bad angle at once. The damage was getting worse with every 100 feet of depth. And then, there is the contribution of pressure. In the ocean, pressure from the water increases by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 33 feet of depth. The Titanic lies approximately 12,500 feet down. So, as the stern fell deeper and deeper, the trapped air pockets inside it were being squeezed smaller and smaller. At a certain depth, the steel hull could no longer withstand the force of the ocean pressing against those hollow compartments. The air inside was compressed, the structure tore, water surged inward with catastrophic force. This was not an explosion outward, it was a violent inward collapse driven by overwhelming external pressure, an implosion. Decks were crushed down onto one another, bulkheads were ripped free. Compressed air rebounded outward, dragging interior fittings, luggage, and fragments of metal with it, producing the inverted peeling patterns visible on the wreck today. The stern's forward section, already weakened during the breakup at the surface, completely disintegrated on the way down. This implosion happened while the stern was still falling through the water column, not when it hit the bottom. What reached the seabed was not a section of a ship in the process of sinking. It was something that had already been demolished in the water above. The final blow was that the stern did not drift softly onto the seabed. The aft end of its keel is now driven deep into thick, clay-like sediment, showing exactly how hard that section hit. So, whatever damage had already been done during the fall, the impact finished off what remained. A section that had already been torn apart, rolled, crushed inward, and shaken by 2 miles of turbulent descent, now slammed into the bottom with enough force to bury itself in the ocean floor. It would be wrong to blame the stern's condition on any one of these forces alone. It was not just the breakup at the surface. It was not just the pressure. It was not just the corkscrewing fall, or the implosion, or the impact. It was all of them, arriving one after the other, stacking damage on top of damage across the full length of the descent. How the wreckage still continues. But the wreck of the Titanic is not frozen in place. It is being consumed. What most people see in documentary footage as those haunting orange formations hanging off the ship like icicles are not passive rust. They are living structures, dynamic microbial communities made up of organisms that feed on iron and excrete fine metallic residue. Scientists call them rusticles, and they are one of the most significant and least discussed forces at work on the wreck site. In 2010, scientists formally identified a new species of bacteria taken from rusticle samples collected at the Titanic site. They named it Halomonas titanicae. This organism is an extremophile, perfectly adapted to darkness, near freezing temperatures, crushing pressure, and the specific salinity of the deep North Atlantic. Its food source is iron, the ship's hull is its ecosystem, and it has been feeding, uninterrupted, since the wreck settled on the ocean floor in 1912. The rate of consumption is measurable and significant. Estimates suggest These bacterial colonies are consuming between a tenth and nearly a quarter of a ton of iron from the wreck every single day. Other estimates put the daily iron loss at between 0.13 and 0.2 tons. At that rate, the wreck will not vanish overnight, but the structural consequences are already visible and accelerating. Thin steel plates have disappeared entirely. Load-bearing structures are weakening. What remains of the stern is gradually folding under its own weight. The stern is particularly vulnerable. Because it was already torn open, it presents a far greater surface area to seawater than the bow does. More exposed metal means more entry points for bacteria. More entry points mean faster decay. The stern began this long decline in a condition the bow never experienced, and the decades since have only widened that gap. Even the bow, which has seemed almost indestructible by comparison, is losing the fight. Recent expeditions have documented the collapse of once familiar features. Captain Smith's bathtub, one of the most photographed interior spaces on the wreck, has disappeared beneath debris. The gymnasium on the starboard side is beginning to fail. The roof of the Marconi wireless room, where the Titanic's distress calls were sent in the final hours before it sank, stands in a precarious state. In 2019, explorers returned from the wreck site, describing severe deterioration in the officers' area, with famous features either vanished or barely recognizable. By 2024, one of the most iconic elements of the entire wreck had been lost. A large section of the bow's portside railing had detached and dropped into the mud below. That railing had been a centerpiece of Titanic imagery since 1985. If even that could give way, then nothing on the ship should be considered permanent anymore. Experts predict that within the next 20 to 50 years, the recognizable structure of the Titanic will cease to exist. It will deteriorate into an unformed mass of iron oxide on the seabed. The stern, already fragmented and most heavily attacked, will be the first to dissolve entirely into the sediment. The ocean is reclaiming what belongs to it, atom by atom, and there is no means to halt the process. This is why so many recent expeditions have shifted their focus from exploration to documentation. The 2022 project that produced multiple images and millions of laser measurements is to serve as a record of what the wreck looked like at that moment, before the ocean takes more of it away. Why we look away. By now, the question of why the stern is in such a terrible state has been answered. The physics are clear, the timeline is established, but there is a second question that physics alone cannot answer. Why, knowing all of this, do people still avoid looking? The answer reaches into something that has less to do with the Titanic and more to do with how human beings process catastrophe. The bow of the Titanic, preserved in outline, allows us to sustain a particular kind of narrative. It resembles a stage after the actors have departed, grand, sorrowful, and somehow dignified. You can gaze at the bow and imagine human ambition at its height, defeated by nature but not destroyed by it. There is something almost romantic about the image. The great ship, resting quietly in the dark, still holding its shape after more than a century. It evokes a gentle kind of mourning, a refined melancholy. It gives people a version of the disaster they can hold without flinching. The stern tells a different story. It is not a stage, it is a crime scene. It is the physical embodiment of everything the disaster actually did. The tearing, the crushing, the implosion, the violent end that the bow's composed silhouette allows us to forget. And it is more than that. The stern is where many passengers gathered as the ship made its final plunge. As the bow went under and the stern rose almost vertical out of the water, the people who had not made it into lifeboats were clinging to railings, to each other, to anything they could reach. The stern was the last thing they stood on. It was the setting for the last minutes of panic, for screams, for everything the official story of the Titanic has historically been reluctant to describe too precisely. The stern shows the evidence of what the ocean did to the ship, evidence of what the final minutes were like for the people still on it, evidence that no amount of careful framing or selective camera angles can soften into something bearable. The physical condition of the stern is the most honest record that exists of what happened on April 15, 1912. And that honesty is exactly what makes it so difficult to confront. One researcher described it plainly. The bow can still feel like a memorial, The stern feels like violence stopped in place. It strips away the last bit of comfort. It does not invite you to admire the ship. It forces you to face what was done to it. There is also something specific to the Titanic story that deepens this avoidance. The Titanic has been, from the very beginning, a story that people wanted to believe in. The maiden voyage of the greatest ship ever built, the iceberg, the lifeboats, the band playing as the water rose. These elements have been shaped over more than a century into something that feels almost mythological. A story of human pride meeting nature's indifference, with room for heroism, sacrifice, and a kind of elegance in the telling. The stern does not fit that story. It fits a harder one. It is the part of the Titanic story that is too broken and too painful to talk about openly. And yet, whether we look or not, it remains in eternal darkness, continuing to corrode and fade. The Titanic is not the story of a ship that could not sink. It is the story of the fragility of human ambition. And the forgotten stern is its final, most honest, and most painful chapter. One we have yet to find the courage to read aloud.